In the early 5th century, Chrysostom lamented that there were Christians who observed, quote, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Feast of the Great Expiation, end quote. That's from Bingham's Antiquities of the Christian Church, Book 16, Chapter 6. By the way, expiation was the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. That's Bingham's Antiquities of the Christian Church, Book XVI, Chapter VI. Why do some people, like Chrysostom, why do they get bothered because other people are actually obeying God and obeying what he said in his word? Why? They do because of what Romans 8, verse 7 says. For the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. Or as it says in the New Living Translation for Romans 8, verse 7, for the sinful nature is always hostile to God. It never did obey God's laws, and it never will. Now, what was the practice of the early church? If you go to Acts 13, verse 14, Acts 16, verse 13, Acts 17, verses 1 through 2, and Acts 13, verses 42 through 44, you could see they kept the Sabbath. Indeed, Acts 13, verses 42 through 44 shows Gentiles keeping the Sabbath. And the verse I quoted in Acts 17, verses 1 through 2, that shows it was Paul's custom to keep the Sabbath. What about the holy days of God? Well, if you go to 1 Corinthians 5, verses 7 through 8, you could see the Corinthians were keeping Passover and unleavened bread. Therefore, let us keep the feast. And if you go later in that book to 1 Corinthians 11, verses 23 through 26, Paul was delivering for them to keep the ceremony of the bread and the wine on the night he was betrayed, which was Passover, Nisan 14. They were keeping the bread and the wine on Nisan or Abib 14. And we know that the true church continued to do that. Even in the late 2nd century, we have clear records in Eusebius that the churches in Asia Minor were keeping Passover on the 14th. That's why they were called Quartodecimans. Whereas the churches in the rest of the world, led by the church at Rome, were keeping a different holiday on a Sunday. If you don't believe me, read the letter of Polycrates, spelled Polycrates. He was the bishop of Ephesus in Asia Minor. Read the letter of Polycrates to Victor, the bishop of Rome. That'll prove it to you. Now, we also see God's holy days being kept if you go to Acts 12, verses 3 through 4. Passover and unleavened bread. If you go to Acts 27, verse 9, you could see that they were making note of the Feast of the Great Expiation, also known as Yom Kippur or the Day of Atonement. That's Acts 27, verse 9. That's what fast means. If you go to Acts 20, verse 6, you could see that they were keeping unleavened bread, and they weren't in Jerusalem, and they were still keeping it. And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. That's Acts 20, verse 6. Why wait until after unleavened bread unless you were keeping it? That's the only reason it makes sense to wait, because they were keeping it. If you go to Acts 20, verse 16, for Paul had determined to sail by Ephesus because he would not spend the time in Asia, for he hasted, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. Pentecost is one of the commanded holidays in Leviticus 23 and elsewhere, one of God's 7 holy days. Do we see that? So he was keeping Pentecost clearly. He kept all 7 of the holy days mentioned in Leviticus 23. Why wouldn't he? I just showed you in the early 5th century there were Christians keeping those holidays. If you go to Acts 2, verse 1, and when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a mighty rushing wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit. So God gave them the Holy Spirit on Pentecost. They were keeping the day of Pentecost. It was one of his commanded holy days. This weekend we have 2 commanded holy days. At sunset Friday night, the 7th-day Sabbath, which I showed you the Apostolic Church kept in the book of Acts, that begins. And then at sunset Saturday begins the day of Pentecost, which I showed you that they were clearly keeping in the book of Acts as well. Will you follow God's commanded holy days, or will you follow the masses? It's up to you. Peace all. Bye-bye.